the sacrifice lamb.
Exploring the Gospels with Dr. Robert Lindsay. An examination of the beliefs of historical Christianity as proven through Scripture. Dr. Robert Lindsay.
We've been talking for several episodes, several programs now, about a special theme related to exploring the Gospels. You know, the Gospels are full of marvelous, wonderful things, and they're revealed to us when we take the right tools. I've been talking about, as it were, the right tools all this time during these episodes, because it is my firm conviction that only when we look to the Greek text of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and especially Matthew and Luke, and then translate that Greek text back to Hebrew, or attempt to translate it back to Hebrew, and do we then begin to see what riches are therein, right there in the gospel. In my view, the trouble with so many scholars of the New Testament has been that they have treated the New Testament as if it was only a matter of learning Greek and reading Greek and translating it back to English. And today, you know, there are many translations of all kinds. People are often confused because of the many translations. The translations are sometimes paraphrases, and that may be very good because they act like commentators. But if the translator of the New Testament, especially of the Gospels, though this is not really so true of the epistles of Paul and others, if the translator does not know both Hebrew and Greek, does not know that he has to translate from Greek back into Hebrew in order to find out what are the roots back of that particular chapter and that verse and that particular passage, he is going to make some very serious mistakes, at least very often. Now, most of the time, the stories in our Gospels are perfectly clear. They've been translated from Greek to English traditionally for hundreds of years. Most of the points that we see are clear enough. But as I've been trying to say all along, they aren't always clear enough. For example, we don't learn from just looking at the Greek, "Forgiven are your sins," that Jesus said to the paralyzed man, that these are words that only God uses. We can only understand that when we take the Greek text, put it back to Hebrew, and see that the expression used for forgiving sins that Jesus is using is something that is only allowed, as a word only allowed to deity, to God himself. So Jesus is taking upon himself the prerogative of declaring in that particular way that he is not only Messiah, but he is God Messiah, that he is God's representative on earth. He is a divine Messiah. He is deity Messiah. He is all these things incarnate among men. And Jews of the period understood him. And so he did not have to go around saying, "I am God," or "I am Messiah," or among these things. It was not his way. He did it in a different kind of way. To this particular period, I thought perhaps we better take a look at another kind of expression that indicates to us so very, very clearly who Jesus really was. Now, I said last time in our last episode that when Peter said, "Thou art the Christ," or the Christ of God, or Mashiach, God Messiah, that when Peter said those words, he was not saying something new to the disciples. They didn't just finally come to the conclusion that Jesus was a Messiah. They had believed all along that he was Messiah, but that particular phrase, Messiah God, God Messiah, Peter used, and Jesus liked it. Jesus said, this is it in a nutshell. This is who I am as a Messiah in a nutshell, if I may use that word. And approved it and said that this was from his Father. God revealed this thing to Peter. And Peter had understood it and put it in the right kind of form, and Jesus was going to build his church on it. The kingdom was going to be built all along, all through the ages, because he was going to be Messiah God, God Messiah, the leader, the one who is in charge. But all along, the disciples have been calling Jesus Lord. And early in the book of Luke, for example, we find Peter, when he gets called to be a fisher of men. In the 5th chapter of Luke, as Jesus talks to them and talks to from the two boats, or from one of the boats, that is to say, belonged to Simon Peter, to the crowd along the shore, he asks Peter to move out into the depth and take up fish. Fetch, saying, well, he said, we've been fishing all night. We can't do that. It won't do any good. We're sure there's no fish out there. Peter said, nevertheless, you said it, and I'll do it. Now, at that point, and up to that point, we do not hear Peter saying, Lord, to Jesus in exactly these words. He uses another word, master. But when the net gets full of fish, hundreds and hundreds of fish, and the fish nets start breaking, Peter says, depart from me, falling down on his knees, saying to Jesus, depart from me, I'm a sinful man, O Lord. O Lord is what he calls Jesus so very clearly. Evidently he called him that before, but we are certain here that he did say at that time. And this was, you might say, not his conversion. He must have already been following Jesus along. But it is the first time that we hear Jesus calling him to a special task, and he responds by saying, O Lord. In the very next story in the Gospel of Luke, he comes to a city and finds a leprous man. And this man comes up to him and says, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. Now, because people have not gone back to the Hebrew, but have stayed with the Greek, so very often they have thought the word Lord means Mr. What we say, Mr. I say to you, Mister, could you help me get to the city? It could be, help me to do this. Could you help me to do that? We say, Mister. And so people have thought oftentimes that the word Lord in Jesus' day meant Mister. And in Greek, it could mean that. But once you put the Greek text back into Hebrew, as I've been saying all along, where to do, then we find that the word Lord has a great deal more meaning. When Jesus quoted David as saying, sit thou on my right hand until I make thy enemies thy footstool, and so on, when he quoted that Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, he asks, why did David call the Messiah Lord, the one that was coming, Lord? What he is actually saying, in saying the word Lord, is that he was saying, David was saying, Jesus is the Messiah that's coming is much bigger than anything else. He is my Lord. He is my complete master, the one who tells me what to do and is going to tell me what to do. So the word Lord, although we can say, and do say easily in Greek, might mean just Mister, it cannot mean that when we come to talking about Jesus. When Jesus says Lord, and when he mentions the Lord, and when the disciples call Jesus Lord, they're saying, you're the leader. You're the one that are making all the choices. You're the one that is going to direct this kingdom that we're a part of, this movement that we're a part of. You are Lord. And so it is, if you'll follow the Gospel of Luke, for example, go through the Gospel of Luke, and every time you find the word Lord, notice one of two things. Either it's a disciple that is saying Lord, or all the disciples are saying Lord, or it's a person who is beginning to follow Jesus Christ. In the case of this leper, he apparently called Jesus Lord because he was prepared to follow Jesus. The leper went off, showed himself to a priest, he was healed, and he must have come back and followed Jesus, for Jesus was his Lord. If I may use another passage in the 6th chapter of and the 5th verse, we find a little more elaboration of just exactly what this meaning of Lord meant. For the disciples had been going through, and it was a Sabbath, and they were rubbing the grain between their hands. And as they rubbed the grain between their hands, they were criticized by some of the more religious people around. And then Jesus says various things about why it is that the believers are free on Sabbath to eat when they need, as David did, and as some other instances they did in the Old Testament. And finally he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And you see the word, the expression Lord used in this firm, positive, tremendously important way. The Lord is the divine leader. He is also Lord of the Sabbath. In terms of the way the Jewish people spoke and understood, this is one of the most radical statements that Jesus ever made. The Sabbath was considered by the Pharisees and by other leaders in the period to be the great, the wonderful day which God had given in each week, in which one man is to worship, he's not to work and do other things. And so it was called often, the Sabbath was called often the Queen, God's great Queen, the Sabbath Queen, because this was considered to be, to delight in Sabbath was one of the most wonderful things you could possibly do. Still a wonderful thing in a way to do. But my point is that Sabbath had come to be as important almost as all of the law to the people in Jesus' day. And Jesus is now saying, in one of the most remarkable statements that he ever made, the Son of Man, this third person expression that we've been talking about, is Lord of the Sabbath. He is the head of the Sabbath. He determines what the Sabbath is. He determines, in other words, how you shall act as a believer in Jesus Christ, how everyone should act as a believer in Jesus Christ. Lord, Lord. He is Lord. He's the absolute master. There's another passage or two that I would like to call your attention to in closing this episode, and that is remind you that the man who was on the cross next to Jesus, at that very man that was hanging there, two men were hanging, one on each side, but the one of them criticized Jesus and said, you could deliver us from this, why don't you deliver us from these crosses? You are what you are, and you say. The other man said to the man, the other, why do you rail against him? He said, he is a good man, and so on. And then he turned to Jesus and he said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Here was a man who was turning from a life which had been full of enough criminal activities that he was being hanged on a cross, next to Jesus, seeing in Jesus something so wonderful that he could only express himself in these words, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. To remember someone to come into his kingdom means save me. Bring my name before God, as it were, in this case. Make it. You know what Jesus said to him? He said, today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus answered that question just that quick. And the man simply called upon him and said, Lord. If you and I really want to get to where the secret of life really is, and the secret of this word, these scriptures that we've been dealing with, of the claims of Jesus, you and I have to say, Lord. And when we say, Lord, things will begin to happen. We will find our salvation. We will find our way to paradise, as Jesus said it. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus is already reigning. Jesus is already reigning. We already belong, if we are following him, to his lordship. To belong to the lordship of Christ means to belong to him as king of his kingdom. We have this great and wonderful joy of beginning and starting and continuing to follow him who is Lord. If he says, do this, we do that. Do this, we do whatever he said. There isn't anything that Jesus says as Lord that doesn't fall upon us and doesn't apply to us. Is he your Lord, is my question at this time. Make him your Lord this day.